Dr. Mark Shangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I was going to talk about, we're 2 years in on COVID hysteria, and something that we've talked about before is why were some people susceptible to collective hysteria back in March of 2020, and why were some not? And there's a few reasons that, as we've talked about, I think one of the most important explanations for probably why folks may have avoided it was ultimately their position within the network. If I was in the same position as many of the folks that became part of the collective hysteria and thought that COVID was a disproportionately dangerous virus and that you had to overturn society to protect ourselves from it and violate civil rights and mass and so forth, if I was in the same position within their network as were they, I think I too would have felt all of the same reasons, for all the reasons that we've talked about in previous moments. I'm getting that same information from all of those same high reputation people in my network that I usually trust, and most of what we believe is not based upon our own research. It's based on what the high reputation folks around us believe. Even I, as a scientist, may have just a dozen or 24 things that I've come to know by virtue of my own research studies, so to speak, and not by virtue of those in my network. So I think it's mostly about where you are in your network, and I've talked about being aloof in earlier Science Moment videos. I've tried to arrange my life so that I am positioned not in those spots within the network where I could suddenly be susceptible to groupthink. And another thing that we've talked about is just having a strong attachment and understanding of civil liberties generally, so that you hold them even if you're freaked out. Because there's no point in holding civil liberties and believing in fundamental rights and free expression and informed consent and so on, is as if as soon as you think you have a perceived emergency, you overthrow all that. Because when there's no emergencies going on, none of those things really matter, because they don't really come up. People are typically being nice to one another 99% of the time. The point of having those principles at all is for when there are perceived emergencies. So having those things instilled in us, as they have been instilled in me, was certainly another thing in my case, and in I think many cases, that helped prevent people from falling into it. Or at least maybe they became afraid, but they didn't start advocating for civil rights overturning interventions. But another one in my case, I'm half Iranian, and you may have heard about my wise Persian wife, and my dad came from Iran, and in 1965 or so, he came here as a med student. And so I myself have experienced targeted outgroup prejudice by virtue of a mass hysteria, collective hysteria that happened here in the United States. And it really did, despite sort of talking about this for 2 years, it really only just occurred to me just a couple days ago that happened at an impressionable age to me. So, for those that are young, they didn't go through this, and they may have heard about it, maybe not. But so my dad comes here in 1965. He marries my mom, and by 1979, I'm 10 years old. My sister's 9, and then the hostage crisis happens, and so 50 or so hostages were taken by Iran during the revolution, and these during those a little bit over a year. This was all that was talked about in the news in the United States. So Iranians before this were just one of many foreign, faraway, vaguely Middle Eastern people that Americans had no stereotypes per se about, relative to the other places in the Middle East. So there was basically, people had no idea what Iran was, but suddenly, just overnight, suddenly Iranians were the enemy. They were unclean, dirty, evil people. And you could feel it. So my parents sat down and talked to me and my sister and told us we're no longer Iranian. We are Persian. People didn't really know what Persia was. Persia is just really a synonym for Iran. We're referring more to the historical, the longer provenance of that area. But we just suddenly called ourselves, we're Persian. People don't really know what that is, right? And lots of Iranian rug carpets suddenly changed their name, and they became Persian rug carpet markets and so forth. So people tried to scrub their identity of being Iranian because it had become unclean. You were now the targeted outgroup, just like we've been talking about, just like unvaccinated have, and many other kinds of targeted outgroups that we've talked about. So just somehow, despite me having gone through it, in all of these examples, I'm typically looking at the Jews during World War II and Cultural Revolution in China, and in Iran, the Islamic Revolution there led to a lot of people who are in the out group, and still to this day, women who are not wearing hijabs are in the out group and are treated as unclean, people that are not sufficiently religious and so forth. But it happened to me myself. It happened to Iranians in America. And at 10 years old, I didn't fully appreciate it, but you could feel it. You could feel it all around you. And I was not just the target of it, but I was part of the hysteria in another sense. My sister looks more Persian. I don't really look particularly Persian. No one knows that I'm Persian. So I'm there at school, and kids they knew I was Iranian, but the unclean friend of yours that's close to you is not unclean. He's the counterexample to the rule, that kind of thing. So no one was really mean to me, per se. So I'm sitting there hearing all of the kinds of rhetoric that happens, and when these narratives change and Iran is the enemy, I'm hearing it all around me. I'm part of it. I'm part of the jokes. I'm part of hearing all the kinds of memes that are spreading through, and it's being instilled in me, so I can feel the strong forces that happen, the psychosocietal forces that lead me to also not like Iranians. Iranians really are bad. I mean, I can feel why someone would have this, because it's just every moment on TV, 24/7, talking about it, just like they've been talking about vaccinations and the unvaccinated are bad and so forth, and people have to wear masks just all the time, everywhere you go. It's this constant reverberating messages that are going through. So at 10 years old, a very impressionable person, I myself had witnessed that change and saw it happen. And I think, and what I suffered, in terms of prejudice is sort of just a pale nothing compared to folks that are, dealing with racism and so forth. But what I did manage to see was the change overnight. A lot of people are born into racism. They didn't see it suddenly turn on in one day. And that, I think, is almost more informative in some sense. You say, oh my God, you're just seeing the winds blow, and then suddenly the winds are blowing the other direction the very next day. And it's hard to see that when it's not directed at you. When it's directed at you, it's really salient. And so, my father, who had a medical practice, he can't just change his name. He's Changizi. People don't really know, but they had come to know that he himself was Iranian, and there's no way to take that off. So, I believe personally his practice was always handicapped. It was just getting up and running when the revolution hit, and this mass hysteria against the Iranians hit, and is still with us today. If you think about your general base feelings that you have towards Iran, they're invariably probably pretty bad. I mean, Iranians and you love Iran, they're all sweethearts, but you know in your bones that you've felt within the culture and the narrative of the culture that Iran is really a kind of enemy, and that came out of that hostage crisis and everything that happened after that. So I think that's a third of many potential reasons that, in my case at least, help insulate me from collective hysteria. And for all I know, it's even shaped the way that I approached science itself, trying to keep myself insulated from these sorts of groupthings. And that was your science moment.